The clock on the microwave blinked 5 a.m., a harsh, neon pulse in the dark. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing against the walls like rising water. Outside, the world was still frozen in the deep gray of pre-dawn. He did not turn on the overhead light. He sat perfectly still, his hands flat against the cold surface of the wood. The air felt heavy, stagnant. Trapped in the narrow space between the cabinets and the floor, he pushed his phone across the table, face down, ignoring the phantom vibration of incoming notifications that flickered against the grain of the table. He did not check the screen. He did not react to the digital chatter waiting in the dark. He simply watched the shadows stretch across the floorboards, measuring the stillness of the room. Every breath he drew felt distinct, sharp, and measured against the absolute quiet of the morning. He was isolated here, removed from the noise of the coming day. He waited for the rhythm of the house to settle, grounding himself in the solitary weight of the early hour. The silence was not empty. It was a barrier he had built to keep the rest of the day at bay. Mark shifted his weight, the chair legs scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. He reached into the center of the table and pulled the notebook toward him. The leather cover was worn, the edges soft from years of handling. He opened it to the first empty spread. The paper was crisp, white, and intimidating in its emptiness. His hand hovered over the page, the pen gripped firmly between his fingers. He did not move for a long beat. The ink sat dry in the cartridge, waiting. He looked at the vast, blank surface, feeling the gravity of the goal he was about to set. He lowered the pen, the tip touching the fiber of the paper. He pressed down. The first stroke was deliberate, a firm line that anchored him to the intent. He began to write, his hand moving with a steady, controlled rhythm that defied the morning chill. He formed the words slowly, ensuring each letter carried the weight of his commitment. I am building a $1 million investment portfolio through disciplined monthly contributions. He finished the sentence and pulled the pen back. He read the words aloud, his voice low and steady, filling the empty room with the sound of his own resolve. The digital clock on the wall flickered, a steady, rhythmic pulse of red light that cut through the gloom. It was 5:01 a.m. Then 5:02. The numbers clicked forward with a mechanical indifference that seemed to mock the stillness of the room. Mark watched the colon blink, a tiny, insistent heartbeat that measured the narrowing window of his solitude. With every shift of the digits, the room felt smaller, the walls leaning in just a fraction more. The light from the clock caught the edge of his notebook, casting a long, distorted shadow that danced across the table every 60 seconds. He watched the seconds bleed away, feeling the pressure mount behind his eyes. The passing time was no longer just a measurement. It was an adversary, demanding he justify his existence before the rest of the world woke up. He tapped his pen against the wood, the sharp, repetitive sound syncing with the clock's pulse. He needed to lock in his intent before the morning light rendered this quiet space obsolete. He took a deep, jagged breath, forcing his focus back to the page. The flickering red light reflected in his pupils, a constant reminder that his window to reshape his life was already shrinking. The phone lay on the wooden surface, a dark rectangle of glass and circuitry that felt heavy with unread demands. It buzzed, a sharp, metallic tremor that vibrated through the grain of the table. Mark felt the familiar itch to reach out, to see who was calling, to check the flood of data waiting in the ether. His fingers twitched. The device hummed again, a persistent, rhythmic intrusion that shattered the fragile silence he had built. He stared at the screen, watching the light bleed from the edges of the casing. It was a tether to a world he was trying to outgrow. He reached out, his hand steady, and gripped the edges of the frame. The glass was cool against his skin. He did not unlock it. He did not swipe to clear the alerts. Instead, he lifted the phone and flipped it over with a sharp, decisive movement. It landed face down against the wood with a dull, final thud. The vibrations continued. A muffled, frantic scratching against the table, but he pulled his hands away and tucked them beneath the edge of the notebook. The phantom hum died out, leaving him in a vacuum of his own making. He sat motionless, breathing in the quiet, finally undisturbed by the reach of the digital tide. The notebook lay open, its pages pale and expectant under the dim light. Mark ran his thumb along the binding, the texture of the leather rough and familiar beneath his skin. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket, the metal barrel cold. He hovered the tip over the first line, the space feeling vast and intimidating. A moment of hesitation caught him. The blank page demanded a commitment that could not be erased. He pressed the nib down, testing the flow against the corner of the sheet, watching a small, dark blot bloom into existence. He took a steadying breath, his shoulders dropping from his ears as he focused every ounce of his intent on the paper. He began to write. The ink flowed in a smooth, controlled line, carving his ambition into the fiber of the page. He wrote, "I am building a $1 million investment portfolio through disciplined monthly contributions." The letters were sharp, deliberate, and final. He finished the sentence and lifted the pen, watching the dark ink catch the light as it set into the paper. The physical act of writing had transformed the abstract thought into a concrete reality. He did not move, keeping his eyes locked on the declaration, watching the ink dry as if it were the foundation of a structure he had just begun to build. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the kitchen table. He kept his eyes fixed on the ink that still seemed to shimmer against the white paper. He took a slow breath, the air whistling faintly through his nostrils, and adjusted his posture. The silence of 5 in the morning was absolute, a heavy presence that seemed to wait for him to fill it. He cleared his throat, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the stillness like a blade. He didn't rush. He let his gaze trace the letters of the $1 million goal one more time, ensuring the weight of the words matched the intent behind them. He sat up straighter, grounding his feet firmly against the floorboards. He opened his mouth, testing the air with a soft, barely audible murmur, feeling the shape of the syllables on his tongue. Then he spoke. The words were clear, measured, and steady. "I am building a $1 million investment portfolio through disciplined monthly contributions." The sound of his own voice startled the quiet, vibrating against the walls and settling into the corners of the kitchen. He did not look away from the page. He let the final syllable hang in the air, a declaration that had now moved from the ink of his notebook into the very atmosphere of the room. Mark pushed the chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. He stood, his legs feeling stiff after the long period of stillness. He did not look back at the notebook. Instead, he turned away from the table, his movements slow and intentional. He walked across the kitchen, his boots making a rhythmic thud on the linoleum. He reached the counter and pressed his palms against the edge, feeling the cold, hard surface under his skin. He took one step back, aligning his spine against the cabinetry. He adjusted his stance, heels locked, weight evenly distributed. The room around him was dim, but he did not care to look at it. He squeezed his eyelids shut, cutting off the sight of the kitchen, the table, and the notebook. He focused on the darkness behind his eyes, waiting for the external world to fade into insignificance. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate as he leaned his full weight back, creating a physical anchor for the mental work ahead. He did not move a muscle. He simply stood there, breathing in the quiet, completely detached from the physical space he occupied, readying himself to construct a vision that would dictate his path forward. The peeling paint on the ceiling, once a nagging reminder of neglect, dissolved into a featureless gray void. Mark focused his intent until the gray began to sharpen. Columns of figures materialized in the darkness, crisp and black against a stark white field. He watched the numbers. They were not static. He traced the movement of the decimal points as they shifted right, one position at a time. The balances climbed with a rhythmic, predictable momentum. He felt the phantom resistance of the pen in his hand, though he held nothing. He saw his own fingers moving across the imaginary surface, signing documents with a steady, practiced hand. Each signature carried the weight of a completed transaction. There was no hesitation in his mind. The ledger was a living thing, expanding under his scrutiny. He watched the totals grow, absorbing the reality of each digit. He felt the cold texture of the paper beneath his fingertips and the faint smell of fresh ink. The kitchen had vanished entirely. In its place stood this architecture of growth, anchored by his unwavering focus. He held the vision steady, letting the increasing numbers define the space he occupied, until the mental image was as solid and undeniable as the counter pressing against his spine. The ledger faded, replaced by the frame of a doorway. Mark stepped forward in his mind, crossing a threshold into a space that belonged entirely to him. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the texture of solid construction beneath his palm. There was no weight of interest payments here, no monthly reminder of a debt hanging over his head. He walked into the living room and felt the silence. It was not the empty silence of the kitchen, but the heavy, grounded quiet of total possession. He stood in the center of the floor, his feet planted firmly on the hardwood. He looked at the windows, knowing he was the sole occupant. He reached out and touched the window frame, a slow, deliberate movement that confirmed the absence of any external claim on the property. He breathed in the air of the room, clean and still. He imagined the deed, a single document without a lien, resting in a drawer nearby. He felt the shift in his own posture, his shoulders dropping, his jaw relaxing. This was not a dream of luxury. It was a vision of absolute sovereignty. He held this reality in his mind, letting the weight of ownership replace every lingering doubt, until the freedom of the space became a physical sensation in his chest. The vision of the home receded, leaving Mark standing in the quiet kitchen. He did not open his eyes immediately. He shifted his stance, his muscles tightening as he pulled his awareness back to the present. He raised his right hand, fingers curled as if gripping a heavy fountain pen. He began to move his hand in the air, tracing invisible lines across a workspace only he could see. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He watched his own knuckles move, observing the tension in his wrist as he executed a series of complex signatures. Each stroke was measured. He paused between lines, adjusting his grip to ensure the flow remained constant. He did not rush. He imagined the texture of heavy vellum beneath his fingertips and the dark, permanent smear of ink binding him to the terms of his success. He was no longer a man reacting to his environment. He was the architect of his own contracts. He finished the final signature, a sharp, decisive flick of the wrist. He held his hand steady, letting the reality of the action sink into his nervous system. He felt the weight of the pen, the resistance of the paper, and the unwavering resolve of a man who owned every choice he made. He opened his eyes, the kitchen light hitting him, his hand still held in the position of the final signature. Mark did not drop his hand. He kept his fingers locked in that final, firm grip, feeling the phantom pressure of the pen still trapped between them. He stood motionless, his back pressing into the kitchen counter as if it were the bedrock of his new reality. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against his skin with the heavy, undeniable density of a promise already kept. He shifted his weight, testing the floorboards, feeling the solid structure beneath his boots. This was no longer a flicker of imagination or a fleeting goal. It was a gravitational pull. He felt the future settling into his marrow, a solid, immovable mass that demanded space. His pulse slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat, matching the pace of a long-term plan already set in motion. He tilted his head back, watching the ceiling, but he did not see the peeling paint. He felt the cold, sharp texture of success, as if it were a physical object he could reach out and touch. The hope that had driven him an hour ago had hardened into something else. It was no longer a desire. It was a fact, as certain as the rising sun outside the window. He was standing in the middle of a life he had already constructed, the weight of it anchoring him to the present moment. Mark snapped his eyes open. The phantom weight of his future vanished, replaced by the immediate, biting reality of the present. He reached out, fingers closing around the barrel of his pen with a sharp, controlled motion. He pulled the leather notebook directly into the center of the table. His movements were quick, efficient, stripped of all wasted energy. He flipped to a fresh page, the paper rustling loudly in the stagnant morning air. He placed the nib against the surface and pressed down until the paper dimpled. He wrote with heavy, jagged strokes. "High-interest debt is a thief." He stared at the words, the ink still wet and glinting under the kitchen light. He did not see numbers. He saw an intruder reaching into his accounts, siphoning away the hours and labor he had already invested. The realization hit him like a physical blow to his gut. He traced the word thief with the tip of his pen, circling it twice, the pressure tearing slightly into the page. His jaw tightened. He was no longer just building, he was guarding. He sat back, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. He watched the ink dry, his protective instinct sharpening into a cold, focused edge. Every cent was a soldier, and he would not let a single one be stolen. Mark did not pause. He dragged the nib across the page again, the sound of scratching ink filling the silence of the room. He wrote, "Today I will research index funds for 30 minutes. He stopped, the pen held firmly in his grip, and read the line 3 times. It was a specific, actionable command to his future self. He moved to the next line, his hand moving with a fluid, practiced rhythm. "I am grateful for the steady paycheck that funds my future." He pressed the pen into the paper at the end of the sentence, leaving a dark, saturated dot of ink. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, and looked at the ledger entries he had made. The gratitude was not a feeling, it was a tactical recognition. He saw his paycheck as the fuel, the raw material that transformed his abstract goals into a tangible portfolio. He set the pen down, the metal clicking against the wood of the table. He stood up, his spine lengthening, and rolled his shoulders. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were now aligned with the precision of his own intent. He turned his head toward the bookshelf, his eyes scanning the spines of his library. He was ready to move from the page to the next stage of his work. Mark pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the floorboards with a sharp, echoing sound. He walked to the bookshelf, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He scanned the rows of spines, his fingers trailing over the textured surfaces until they stopped. He pulled a thick, heavy volume on finance from the shelf. The book resisted for a moment, the friction of the wood against the cover producing a low, rasping noise. He gripped it with both hands, feeling the substantial heft of the pages and the dense binding. It was not just paper and ink. It was a physical manifestation of the mental labor he was about to undertake. He held the book against his chest for a heartbeat, measuring the weight, then turned back toward the table. He walked with a steady, measured gait, his eyes locked on the desk. He cleared a space on the surface, pushing his notebook to the side, and laid the book down with a solid thud. He stood over it for a second, his hands resting on the cover. He adjusted the angle of the light, pulled his chair forward, and sat down. He did not rush to open it. He took a single deep breath, centered his focus, and reached for the edge of the front cover. Mark flipped the cover open. The pages were crisp, smelling of paper and binding glue. He did not read at a leisurely pace. His eyes snapped to the top of the left column, tracking the lines with a predator's intensity. He processed sentences in blocks, his gaze flicking horizontally with rhythmic precision. He reached the bottom of the first page and flipped it without hesitation. The sound of the paper was sharp in the quiet house. He encountered a dense paragraph detailing market volatility and slowed his scan, his chin dipping closer to the desk. He traced a line with his index finger, grounding his attention to the text. Then, he found the rhythm again. His eyes accelerated, moving faster down the columns as the core concepts began to lock into place. He was not just reading, he was hunting for information. He turned another page, his hand hovering over the margin, ready to engage. The room seemed to dissolve, leaving only the ink, the light, and the rapid, focused movement of his eyes across the page. He absorbed the data, but by the steady, his posture rigid. He was learning at a speed that demanded total concentration, filtering out the world to focus on the mechanics of the market. Mark stopped at a chapter titled The Eighth Wonder. He read the first paragraph twice, his brow furrowing as he processed the geometric progression of growth. The numbers were not just digits, they represented the velocity of his future. He picked up his pen, the nib hovering over the paper for a moment before he pressed down. He drew a line beneath the core formula, the scratching of the pen rhythmic and deliberate. He went back, circled the calculation for monthly reinvestment, and pressed harder, leaving a dark, permanent mark on the page. He stopped to check his own mental math, tracing the path of $1 invested over 20 years. The scale of the result made him pause, his pen stalling mid-air. He looked away from the book, staring at the wall, visualizing the compounding effect as a physical force building momentum. He turned back to the page, his hand shaking slightly from the intensity of the realization. He underlined the final sentence of the section, a heavy stroke that spanned the width of the paragraph. He was not just reading theory, he was observing the mechanics of his own financial architecture. He finished the page, his grip on the pen firm, and moved to the next, hungry for the next layer of the proof. The desk lamp flickered, its yellow glow suddenly appearing fragile against the shifting environment. A pale, thin line of light began to bleed over the horizon, crawling across the floorboards toward his chair. Mark did not look up immediately. He finished the paragraph, his eyes tracking the final sentence with the same relentless speed as before. Then, the ambient light in the room shifted, turning from deep gray to a cool, sharp blue. The transition was absolute. He closed the book. The sound of the cover meeting the table was final, a punctuation mark on his morning study. He stood up, his joints popping in the silence. He turned toward the window. The sky outside was rapidly losing its darkness, the edges of the neighborhood trees becoming visible silhouettes against the brightening sky. The sun was rising, casting long, thin shadows that stretched across his workspace. He watched the light settle on his notebook, illuminating the lines he had written earlier. The time for contemplation had reached its natural threshold. The world outside was waking, and the static energy of the study session had to be converted into physical movement. He pushed the chair back, his gaze fixed on the horizon, feeling the weight of the day beginning to press against the glass. Mark turned his back on the desk and the accumulated knowledge of the morning. His focus shifted downward, narrowing to the pair of sneakers resting near the door. He reached for the left one, his fingers brushing the fabric with practiced familiarity. He pulled the tongue up, creating space, and slid his foot inside. The laces were pulled taut, one segment at a time, each tug tightening the connection between his intent and the ground. He looped the cord, cinched the knot, and gave it a sharp final yank. He repeated the motion for the right shoe, his movements rhythmic and devoid of hesitation. He tested the fit, standing and shifting his weight from heel to toe, feeling the stability of the soles against the floor. Every action was methodical. He adjusted the tension, ensuring the pressure was uniform across his arches. The desk, the book, and the quiet study were now behind him. The physical world awaited his arrival. He stood upright, his posture rigid and ready, his gaze locked on the threshold. The transition was complete. He was no longer a student of theory, but a man prepared for the exertion of the morning. Mark approached the front door with the steady, measured gait of a man who owned every minute of his morning. His hand reached for the deadbolt, the metal cold and biting against his skin. He turned the mechanism, the click echoing through the empty hallway like a hammer strike. He paused for a heartbeat, his fingers resting on the handle. He felt the vibration of the world beginning to stir beyond the wood. He pushed. The door swung inward, and the morning air rushed to meet him. It was a sharp, biting cold that cut through the stale warmth of the house. It hit his face with the force of a physical blow, stinging his cheeks and forcing his eyes to narrow. His lungs expanded, drawing in the crisp, oxygen-rich air that tasted of dew and damp concrete. The transition was instantaneous. The stillness of the interior was replaced by the vast, open space of the neighborhood. He did not hesitate. He crossed the threshold, his boots making a heavy, solid sound on the porch boards. He stood for a second on the concrete step, letting the cold ground his system, fully alert to the vastness of the day ahead. Mark did not walk so much as he launched. His first stride was long, purposeful, and planted firmly against the pavement. He moved past the dark, silent houses with a speed that defied the early hour. The neighborhood slept behind shuttered windows, but Mark was a kinetic force cutting through the stillness. His arms pumped at precise angles, his head held high, eyes scanning the horizon. He reached the first corner and turned, his boots striking the asphalt with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed off the brick walls. A gradual incline appeared, threatening to break his momentum. Mark did not slow. He leaned into the ascent, driving his knees higher, his body becoming an engine of pure, disciplined intent. The resistance in his calves sharpened, but he kept the count steady in his mind. He hit the crest of the hill and lengthened his stride again, the descent pulling him forward. He was a machine now, shedding the stillness of his kitchen in favor of raw, kinetic output. He navigated the grid of the streets with unwavering precision, ignoring the urge to coast, forcing his muscles to adhere to the unwavering tempo he had set for his own success. Mark focused on the connection between his lungs and his legs. He inhaled in a three-step count, a deep, controlled pull of air that filled his chest, followed by a sharp, rhythmic exhale over the next 3 paces. The sound of his breath became a metronome, overlaying the steady slap of his sneakers against the road. He felt the oxygen circulating, fueling the muscles in his legs, turning the physical effort into a deliberate act of will. The incline of the street no longer mattered. He adjusted his breath depth to match the strain, keeping the cycle unbroken. His mind cleared of all clutter, leaving only the sensation of movement and the internal clock of his stride. He narrowed his focus to the point of impact where his heel met the ground, timing the start of his next breath to the exact moment of weight transfer. It was a closed loop of energy, a self-sustaining cycle where every physical movement was validated by a corresponding breath. It was no longer just walking. He was choreographing his own physical state, forcing his biology to mirror the rigid, disciplined structure of his financial goals. The world around him faded until there was only the cadence, the inhale, the exhale, and the absolute, unwavering rhythm of his own resolve. Mark held the rhythm for 10 more blocks before he brought himself to a deliberate, sudden halt. He stood in the center of the intersection, the pavement cold beneath his feet, the sky beginning to show the first pale bruising of dawn. The world was entirely silent, devoid of traffic, neighbors, or noise. He took a long, steadying breath, feeling the air expand against his ribs. He looked at the row of dark, identical houses, then ahead at the long, empty stretch of asphalt. He did not shout. He did not need to. He spoke in a low, resonant tone, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "I control my financial future." The words hung in the damp, morning air, heavy and absolute. He watched the sound dissipate into the quiet, feeling the vibration of his own conviction settle deep in his chest. He did not move immediately after speaking. He let the silence return, letting the weight of the statement anchor him to the ground. He was the only moving thing in a static landscape, a singular point of intent in a city still asleep. He felt the cold air on his face, the pulse in his neck, and the certainty that the universe had just received his directive. He turned, resumed his pace, and moved forward with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who had claimed his territory. Mark pushed forward, his pace steady, but the wind shifted, catching him off guard. It whistled through the gaps between the houses, swirling leaves and debris across the asphalt in chaotic, unpredictable patterns. He felt the sudden resistance against his chest, a physical push that could easily force a man off balance if he were not prepared. He stopped, digging his heels into the gravel of the road edge, leaning slightly into the force of the air. He watched the leaves dance in the storm of the gust, a perfect, messy representation of the financial world he was fighting to master. The market was not a machine. It was a storm of noise, panic, and irrational swings. He stood firm, his lungs stable, his gaze locked on the empty road ahead. He did not flinch as the wind battered his shoulders. He reached into that calm center he had cultivated, pulling up the truth he had written in his journal. "I make wise decisions," he said into the gusts. His voice was not loud, but it was precise, cutting through the whistling air. He felt the logic of his statements solidify, a grounding weight that countered the turbulence around him. He was not a leaf caught in the wind. He was the anchor. He felt the gusts die down, leaving him standing tall, his resolve hardened by the minor ordeal. He took one step, then another, his stride regaining its perfect mechanical accuracy. The final stretch of the route turned sharply upward, a steep incline that demanded a shift in his form. Mark did not slow. He leaned into the slope, his quads burning as he drove each foot into the pavement. Every muscle in his legs tightened with the strain, the rhythm of his breathing becoming sharp and ragged. He could feel the heat radiating off his skin, a stark contrast to the biting morning chill. He reached the crest of the hill, his lungs demanding air, his heart drumming against his ribs with heavy, powerful beats. He stood at the summit, looking down at the path he had traveled. The physical exhaustion was a tool, stripping away the remaining layers of hesitation in his mind. He looked at his calloused palms, clenching them into fists. He had accounted for the debt, the funds, and the logic. Now, he claimed the final piece of his armor. With his gaze fixed on the rising sun, he whispered the last directive into the silence of the neighborhood. "I create value." The words did not just leave his throat. They solidified within him a permanent addition to his mental framework. He felt the armor lock into place. He was no longer just a man walking a street. He was a creator, prepared to engage with the world on his own terms. He turned, his stride now completely effortless, and headed home. Mark remained on the corner, the quiet of the neighborhood pressing in from every side. Not a single car passed. No light flickered in the rows of windows facing the street. He looked left, then right, half expecting to see a neighbor or a passerby to signal the start of the day, but there was nothing. The stillness was absolute. He realized then that he was the only soul awake in this span of pavement. For a moment, he felt the absence of an audience as a void, a lack of confirmation for the work he was doing. He watched the shadows stretch across the asphalt, long and thin, and understood the truth of his position. This resolution did not exist in the eyes of others. It did not require a witness to be valid. He looked at his hands, steady and still in the cool air, and felt the weight of his own presence. The street was a silent, unmoving witness to his discipline, reflecting nothing back but his own image. He did not need the world to acknowledge the change. He was the architect, the builder, and the sole judge of the system he had constructed. He lowered his gaze to the road, his mind clearing of the need for external feedback, leaving only the cold, hard logic of his plan. He was ready. Mark pushed off the curb, his stride lengthening instantly. He did not settle for a comfortable pace. He drove his knees upward, forcing his heart rate to climb with every measured impact against the pavement. The air was sharp, biting at his nostrils as he inhaled deep, jagged breaths. He felt the oxygen flood his system, a cold, clean rush that reached deep into his chest. His lungs began to burn, a tightening, heat-filled sensation that anchored him firmly in the present moment. It was a raw, undeniable signal of life. He focused entirely on that internal heat, the way his muscles demanded more power, the way the rhythm of his feet synchronized with his heartbeat. He leaned forward, pushing through the resistance of the morning air, and the burn intensified. It was not pain, it was proof. He felt the blood surging through his veins, clearing the last traces of lethargy from his limbs. Every breath felt like fuel, expanding his chest and sharpening his focus. He was no longer just moving through the neighborhood. He was commanding the very act of existing. The burn in his lungs was the final confirmation he needed. He was wide awake. He was in control of his physical state, and by extension, he was ready to master everything that followed. The rhythm of his stride turned into a metronome for his thoughts. Each strike of his heel against the concrete sent a jolt of clarity upward, vibrating through his frame and shaking loose the last remnants of lingering hesitation. He felt the fog of the early hour dissolve. With his heart hammering a steady, powerful cadence, his mind began to isolate the variables of his strategy. He mentally audited his progress, stripping away the theoretical to focus on the immediate, actionable steps ahead. The doubt that had clouded his early morning reflections vanished, replaced by a crystalline precision. He focused on the sequence of his upcoming tasks, visualizing the exact flow of his day with the clinical detachment of an engineer. The physical movement was no longer just for stamina. It was a catalyst for intellect. He tested his resolve by forcing himself to recite the core tenets of his financial plan while maintaining his pace. The words came out clear, unhurried, and absolute. There was no room for error, no space for distraction, and no capacity for second-guessing. His thoughts were as sharp as his breathing was controlled. He had successfully purged the static of the previous night, leaving his mind an empty, polished surface ready for the day's work. The transition from physical exertion to mental mastery was complete. He was fully aligned. The rhythm of his stride faltered as he reached the edge of his property. Mark slowed, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet morning. He stopped at the bottom step of his porch and drew a long, controlled breath, feeling the heat radiate from his core. He kept his eyes fixed on the front door, watching the way the early light caught the wood grain. He did not rush. He took a moment to let his heart rate settle, feeling the frantic pulse in his throat gradually synchronize with the stillness of the street. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second over the porch railing, feeling the cold, smooth texture of the wood beneath his palm. This was the threshold. Outside, he had been a body in motion, a force of intent. Inside, he was the architect of his own life. He stood there for a count of 10, listening to the silence of the neighborhood, ensuring that every lingering fragment of physical stress had been purged. His mind was a calm, dark pool. He felt the weight of his resolve settle into his muscles, replacing the fatigue of the run. He looked down at his feet, then back up at the door. He was ready to cross the line. He pushed the front door open, the hinges moving in a low, familiar groan. Stepping inside, He moved directly to the small side table where his phone lay face down. He reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the side button. The screen flared to life, illuminating his palm with a stark, cold blue light. Instantly, the display began to populate. A cascade of text appeared, rows of alerts, red icons, and urgent headers stacking one after another. The device vibrated against his skin, a persistent, rhythmic buzzing that demanded attention. He looked at the screen, but his eyes did not track the individual lines of text. He saw the volume of information as a physical mass, a tide of demands and external triggers, yet he felt no pull to engage with it. He watched the notifications continue to refresh, stacking up in a frantic, vertical queue. They were objects, nothing more. He did not tap a single one. He did not swipe to open, nor did he pause to read the sender names. He simply held the device, feeling the weight of the hardware in his hand, and observed the chaotic influx without letting it touch his resolve. He set the phone back down on the surface, leaving it face up, and walked toward his desk without a backwards glance. Mark pulled the wooden chair back, the legs scraping against the floorboards with a steady, grounding sound. He sat, his spine straight, feet planted firmly on the ground. He looked at the surface of his desk. A stray pen, a stack of unpaid bills, and a coffee mug occupied the space. He moved them. He swept the items aside until the surface was bare, clean, and entirely his own. He placed his hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain. The room was silent, the morning light now fully spilling across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He did not look at the phone left behind on the side table. He did not think about the notifications he had ignored. His world had narrowed to the space directly in front of him. He felt the weight of his earlier preparation. The math, the movement, the affirmations solidified into a quiet, unwavering certainty. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a fresh ledger. He opened it, the pages crisp and blank, awaiting his command. He uncapped his pen, the small click echoing in the stillness. He was not starting a task. He was executing a plan that had already been realized. He leaned forward, his focus absolute, and began to write, his movements precise, deliberate, and entirely free of doubt.